They built a garage that hung over my driveway like it owned the place, and then they told me it wasn't a big deal. I remember standing there, looking up at that roof cutting into my space, and thinking, this is either going to end quietly, or it's going to end badly. Turns out, it didn't end the way they expected. I'd been living in that house for almost a decade at that point, out in a quiet part of Cedar Ridge, the kind of neighborhood where people wave even if they don't know you, where nothing really changes unless someone paints their mailbox a different color. My place sat on a corner lot, nothing fancy, but it had one thing I cared about, a long gravel driveway that ran along the side of the house and stretched all the way back to a detached garage. Now that driveway, that was mine. Always had been. The previous owner next door, an older guy named Walt, he knew it, respected it, never once tried to push the line. We'd even joked about it once over beers, him saying, "That strip right there? That's your kingdom." And I guess, in a small way, it was. Then Walt sold the house. Spring rolled in, and with it came the new neighbors, the Turners. Young couple, mid-30s maybe, 2 kids, a golden retriever that barked at everything. At first, they seemed all right. Friendly enough. The kind of people who smile a lot, but don't really listen. You know the type. The husband, Greg, shook my hand the first day and said, "We're excited to make this place ours." I didn't think much of it at the time. Everyone says that. But about 3 weeks in, things started shifting. I noticed trucks pulling up early in the morning, lumber being unloaded, guys in hard hats walking the property line like they were mapping out a battlefield. One afternoon, I wandered over, hands in my pockets, just curious, and Greg told me they were building a second garage. Said he needed more space, tools, bikes, maybe a workshop. I nodded, said, "Sounds good," but something about where they were pointing didn't sit right with me. It looked close. Too close. Still, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was just the angle. Maybe I was overthinking it. Then one morning, about a week later, I backed my SUV out like I always did, and my side mirror came within an inch, of one of their support beams. I actually hit the brakes and just sat there for a second, heart doing that little jump it does when something almost goes wrong. I got out of the car and looked up. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The edge of their garage roof wasn't just near my driveway. It was hanging over it. By a lot. Not a couple inches, not something you could brush off. It looked like 4, maybe 5 feet of overhang, casting a shadow straight onto my gravel like it belonged there. And I remember thinking, no way. There's no way they didn't know. So I walked over. Calm, at least on the outside. Greg was out there with one of the contractors, holding a coffee, pointing at something on a blueprint. I waited until he noticed me, gave a little nod. "Hey," I said, trying to keep it casual. "That garage, it looks like it's coming over my driveway." He glanced at it, then back at me, and gave this short little laugh, like I'd just told a harmless joke. No, he said, waving his hand. The contractor measured everything. "We're good." I didn't laugh. "Did you get a survey done?" I asked. He shrugged. "Builder handled all that." Then he took a sip of his coffee and added, almost as an afterthought, "I mean, it's just a few feet. You can still get in and out, right?" And that was the moment something shifted for me. Not the garage, not the overhang, him saying that. Like my property line was just a suggestion. Like access was good enough, even if ownership wasn't respected. I nodded slowly, like I was processing it, but inside, I was already making a decision. "All right," I said. "I'll double check on my end." He smiled, like that settled it. "Yeah, go for it." I walked back to my house, but I didn't go inside right away. I stood there in the driveway, looking at that roof hanging over my space, imagining every possible future, scraped vehicles, blocked access, arguments that would drag on for years. And I realized something simple. If I didn't deal with this now, it was never going to get better. So the next morning, I made a call. Not to Greg, not to the contractor. I called the surveyor. And I remember thinking as I hung up, if I'm wrong, I'll apologize. No big deal. But if I'm right, well, then this wasn't going to end quietly after all. The surveyor showed up 2 days later, right around noon, driving this dusty white truck with faded lettering on the side like it had seen 100 property disputes before mine. His name was Dale, late 50s maybe, quiet, steady kind of guy, the type who doesn't waste words because he doesn't need to. He stepped out, looked around once, then at me, and said, "So, somebody built where they shouldn't have?" Like he already knew the answer. I gave a small shrug. That's what I'm trying to figure out. He nodded, grabbed his equipment, and got to work. Now, if you've never watched a proper land survey happen, it's not dramatic, not at first. It's slow, methodical, almost boring if you don't know what you're looking at. But to me, every step felt like something tightening, like a knot being pulled just a little bit tighter with each measurement. Dale walked the perimeter, checked old markers, referenced county records on his tablet, muttered numbers under his breath like he was speaking a language only he understood. Every now and then he'd glance up at the garage, then back down at his equipment, and each time he did, I felt that same quiet confirmation building. About an hour in, he stopped near the edge of my driveway, knelt down, and drove a bright red stake into the ground with a small hammer. The sound, sharp, deliberate, echoed more than it should have. Then he stood up, looked at me, and said, "You might want to take a walk with me." We moved together along the line he was marking, one red stake at a time, forming a boundary that suddenly felt very real, very undeniable. And when we reached the part where their garage sat, he didn't say anything at first. He just pointed. The corner of that structure, it wasn't close to the line. It wasn't even touching it. It was over, by about 4 feet. And the roof? That extended even farther, close to 5. I let out a slow breath, one of those you don't realize you've been holding. "So, I'm not crazy." Dale shook his head. "No, sir. That's a clear encroachment." Clear. There was something about that word that hit different. Not maybe, not arguable. Clear. I thanked him, paid him, and before he left, he handed me a printed report along with a digital copy. Clean, official, impossible to ignore. That evening, I took photos. Every angle I could think of, the stakes, the measurements, the garage corner cutting across the line like it didn't belong to reality. I even took a shot from inside my SUV, showing how tight the clearance had become. Then I printed everything out. The next morning, I walked over and slipped the envelope into their mailbox. No note, no drama, just facts. And then I waited. 1 day passed. Nothing. 2 days. Still nothing. By the 3rd day, I knew exactly what kind of situation this was turning into. Not a misunderstanding, a decision. They'd seen the evidence, and they were choosing to ignore it. So I walked over again. This time, when I knocked, it took a while before the door opened. Greg stood there, but he didn't have that friendly smile anymore. His expression was flat, almost annoyed. "Yeah," he said. I held up the papers. "You get these?" He barely glanced at them. "Yeah." And he sighed, leaned against the doorframe like I was already asking too much. "Look, tearing down part of the garage. That's not happening. It cost a lot of money." I felt something in my chest tighten, but I kept my voice even. "It's on my property." He gave a small, dismissive shrug. "It's a few feet. You've still got space." That same line again. I nodded slowly, then pointed toward my driveway. "I can't get larger vehicles through anymore. I can barely maneuver as it is." He glanced past me, like he was humoring the idea for half a second, then said, "You'll figure it out." And there it was. Not just dismissal, but expectation. Like I was supposed to adapt to his mistake. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch just enough to make it uncomfortable. Then I said, "All right." No arguing. No raised voice. Just that one word. And I walked away. Now, I'll be honest. Part of me wanted to escalate right then and there. Call a lawyer, file something official, drag it into court. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. Legal battles take time. Months, sometimes years. And in the meantime, I'd still be dealing with that garage hanging over my driveway every single day. I didn't want a long fight. I wanted a solution. So I went digging. Property records, zoning rules, access laws, anything that might apply. Nights turned into hours of reading through documents that felt like they were written to confuse people on purpose. But eventually, something clicked. My driveway wasn't shared. It wasn't an easement for both properties. It was entirely on my land. Fully mine. Which meant I had control over how it was used. All of it. And that's when the idea came to me. Not all at once, not like some lightning bolt, but slowly, piece by piece, until it formed into something simple, elegant, and completely unavoidable. If they wanted to treat my driveway like it didn't matter, then I'd remind them exactly where it started and where it stopped. A few days later, I made another call. This time, to a metalwork company across town. I explained what I needed, kept it straightforward. 2 steel posts. 1 heavy crossbar. Installed at the entrance of my driveway. Solid, Permanent. The guy on the phone asked, height clearance? I paused for a second, picturing their garage, the overhang, the exact point where it dipped just a little too low. Then I said, 7 feet. There was a brief silence, like he was doing the math in his head. All right, he said finally. We can do that. We scheduled it for the following week. And I didn't tell Greg. Didn't warn him. Didn't hint at it. Because at that point, I wasn't interested in another conversation. I was interested in results. The morning they showed up, I was already outside, coffee in hand, watching the truck pull in. Same feeling as before, but this time, I wasn't the one being caught off guard. The crew got to work immediately, marking the entrance, digging deep holes on either side of the driveway. Gravel, dirt, the sound of shovels hitting ground. It all felt strangely satisfying. It didn't take long for the Turners to notice. Their front door opened, and both Greg and his wife stepped out, looking confused at first, then concerned. Greg walked over, quick steps, eyes moving from the workers to me. What's going on? He asked. I took a sip of my coffee, set the cup down on the hood of my car, and said, as calmly as I could, installing a clearance bar. A what? A height restriction. For vehicles entering my driveway. He frowned. Why? I met his eyes, just held it there for a second. To protect access to my garage. There was a pause, just long enough for it to start sinking in. Behind us, the workers lifted the steel crossbar into place. And as it rose, you could almost see the realization hit him. You could actually watch it land on his face, that slow shift from confusion to calculation, and then finally to something a little heavier. Realization. Not the kind where someone admits they messed up, but the kind where they suddenly understand the rules have changed and they're not the one setting them anymore. The crew didn't stop. They worked like Greg wasn't even there, guiding that thick black steel bar into place, bolts tightening, metal settling into position with that deep, final sound that says, this isn't temporary. Greg took a step closer, looking up at the bar, then over at his garage, then back at me. 7 feet, he said, like he needed to hear it out loud. Right around there. I said, casual, like we were discussing fence paint. That's low. For some vehicles, I replied. Another pause. Longer this time. Because now he was doing the math. His garage overhang, the part that crossed into my property, sat lower than that bar. Not by a huge margin, but enough. Enough that anything taller than a standard sedan, a truck, a van, even some SUVs, would have to think twice before coming anywhere near that angle. And the way his driveway lined up with the alley behind his house. The only clean turning path into that garage cut right across my driveway entrance. It always had. It was subtle, but necessary. Without that extra space, the turn got tight, real tight. Now it wasn't just tight. It was blocked. Greg turned back to me, his voice sharper now. You can't just do this. I tilted my head slightly. It's my driveway. That's not the point. It kind of is. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing a small circle like he was trying to find the right argument, the right angle that would make this stop. You're making it impossible to use our garage. I didn't answer right away. I just let that sentence sit there between us for a second, let him hear it himself. Then I said, interesting. He stopped pacing. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I said, you built part of your garage over my property, and now you're upset because you can't use it properly. His jaw tightened. We can still use it. Maybe, I said. Carefully. Behind us, my SUV rolled forward as one of the workers tested the clearance. It passed under the bar clean, no issue. Smooth. Designed that way. Greg watched it, then looked back at his garage again. And for the first time since I'd met him, he didn't have anything to say. The crew finished up about 20 minutes later, packed their tools, gave me a nod, and drove off, leaving that black steel bar standing there like a line drawn in permanent ink. And just like that, everything changed. Over the next few days, I didn't have to do much. I just observed. The first attempt came the very next morning. Greg backed his pickup truck down the alley, lined it up with the garage, then stopped. Sat there for a minute, engine idling, staring at the angle. He tried once, slow, cautious, turning the wheel, inching forward, but the moment he approached the driveway entrance, it was obvious. The clearance bar forced him into a tighter path, and that overhang, it hung there like a warning. He backed up, tried again. Same result. Eventually, he parked on the street. Second attempt came later that week with a delivery van. That one didn't even try. The driver stepped out, looked at the bar, looked at the garage, then just shook his head and carried the boxes by hand. After that, the garage became something else entirely. Not a garage. Storage. I'd see the door open occasionally, boxes stacked inside, bikes leaned against the wall, but a vehicle? Almost never. And when they did try, it was always small, careful, tense, like threading a needle that didn't need to be there in the first place. 2 weeks passed like that. And then one evening, just as the sun was starting to drop behind the houses, there was a knock on my door. I already knew who it was. Greg stood there, but this time, he looked different. Not defeated exactly, but quieter, less certain, like he'd spent the last 14 days replaying every decision that led up to this. "Hey," he said. "Hey." There was a brief silence, the kind where both people know why they're there, but neither one wants to say it first. Then he cleared his throat. "Can we talk?" I stepped outside, closed the door behind me. "Sure." He glanced toward the driveway, toward the bar, then back at me. "This situation, it's not working." I folded my arms loosely. "I noticed." He exhaled slow. "Look, I get it. The survey, the property line. Maybe we should have handled that differently. Maybe." I didn't say it out loud, but I let it hang there. He continued, "But tearing down part of the garage, that's a big deal. It's expensive." I nodded once. "It is." Another pause. Then, finally, he said it. "What would it take to fix this?" There it was. Not a demand. Not a dismissal. A question. And here's the thing. I'd thought about that moment more than once. What I'd say if we ever got here. I didn't want to drag it out. Didn't want to win some endless back and forth. I just wanted my property respected. So I kept it simple. "You move the garage," I said. "Fully off my property. No overhang. No corner. Nothing crossing the line." He stared at me, searching for something. Maybe a compromise. Maybe a loophole. "And then," he asked, "then I take down the bar. Straight. Clean. Fair." He looked past me again, toward that black steel beam, like it had suddenly become the most expensive piece of metal he'd ever seen. "That's it. That's it." Another long silence. I could almost hear the numbers running through his head. The cost of rebuilding, the time, the hassle, versus living with a garage he couldn't really use. Finally, he nodded. Slow. Reluctant. But real. "All right," he said. "We'll fix it." And just like that, it was over. Or at least, the fight was. The actual work took another few weeks. Contractors came back. Sections were cut, adjusted, rebuilt. It wasn't pretty for a while, half-finished beams, exposed framing. But eventually, the structure shifted back where it should have been all along. Clear of my property. When it was done, I called the same crew back. They unbolted the crossbar, lifted it off, and just like that, my driveway was open again. No drama. No ceremony. Just space, where there should have been space from the beginning. Now, every now and then, I'll see Greg pull into that garage without any trouble. Clean turn, no hesitation. It works. The way it was supposed to. And we're civil. Not friends. Probably never will be. But we nod. We keep things simple. Boundaries. Clear. Visible. Respected. But I still think about it sometimes. Because here's the part that sticks with me. If I hadn't pushed back, if I'd just accepted that few feet, like it didn't matter, then what? Does it become 3 feet next time? 5. A fence, a shed, something else creeping over the line until the line doesn't mean anything anymore? Or maybe some people would say I went too far, that I could have handled it differently, been more patient, more flexible. I don't know. All I know is this. Respect doesn't usually show up on its own. Sometimes you have to build it. So here's what I'm curious about. What would you have done? Would you have taken the legal route and waited it out? Or done exactly what I did? And where do you draw the line between standing your ground and escalating a situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd think. And if you enjoy stories like this, real situations with real consequences, hit like, subscribe, and stick around, because trust me, not all neighbor disputes end this clean. The day my neighbor ordered me to tear down the retaining wall that had been holding an entire hillside in place for 20 years, I remember standing there with the letter in my hand thinking, well, this is either going to be very funny or very expensive. Turns out it became both. Now before you picture some dramatic Hollywood feud between neighbors, you should know I'm not the kind of guy who looks for trouble. My name's Luke Harper, I'm 47 years old, and I've been running a small landscaping business outside Eugene, Oregon since the late 90s. Dirt, rock, drainage, grading, that's been my world for most of my life. Not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and it teaches you a lot about how land behaves when gravity and water decide to have a conversation. And if there's one thing I've learned after 30 years of digging holes and fixing other people's mistakes, it's that hillsides always win. My house sits on one. Back in 2002, when my wife and I bought the place, it was basically the only property we could afford that had enough space for our kids and a small shop for my equipment. The house itself wasn't anything special, an old cedar place built sometime in the late 70s, but the lot had character, steep character. Picture a slope that drops about 8 feet from my backyard down to the 3 homes behind me. When we first moved in, the ground was soft clay and loose soil, and during the first heavy winter rain, the whole back section started slowly creeping downhill. Nothing dramatic at first, just little signs, cracks in the soil, a fence leaning a few inches more each week. But when you work in landscaping, you learn to read land like a mechanic listens to an engine, and that hillside was whispering trouble. So I did what any guy in my line of work would do. I built a retaining wall. It wasn't fancy, not even close. I used old railroad ties I bought from a salvage yard outside town, heavy, ugly timbers that smelled like creosote and history. The wall ran about 35 feet across the back of my yard and stood roughly 8 feet tall. Not pretty, but solid. Behind it sat somewhere around 180 cubic yards of compacted soil. That wall wasn't decoration. It was the only thing stopping the hill from visiting the neighbors below. Once it was finished, the difference was immediate. My yard leveled out nicely, and the 3 houses down the slope ended up with flat backyards and dry basements. In fact, one of those neighbors, an older guy named Carl Jensen, used to joke that my wall was the best insurance policy he never had to pay for. For almost 2 decades, nobody complained about it. Not once. Carl and his wife lived directly behind us for years, sweet people, the kind who bring over zucchini bread and wave when they mow their lawn. The other 2 houses changed owners once or twice over the years, but nobody ever had an issue with the wall. Most people understood something simple. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Then last spring, everything changed. Carl sold his place and moved to Arizona after his wife passed, and about a month later, a moving truck showed up at the house behind mine. Out stepped a woman in designer sunglasses, crisp white sneakers that had clearly never touched mud, and the kind of confident walk that tells you she's used to giving orders. Her name was Vanessa Caldwell. I didn't know it yet, but Vanessa had just become the new president of our neighborhood HOA. Now, normally, I don't care much about HOA stuff. Our little subdivision is small, maybe a dozen homes, and for the most part, the association only exists to manage shared road maintenance and keep people from turning their yards into junkyards. Nothing too dramatic. But Vanessa was different. You could tell from day one she had plans. The first time we spoke was actually pretty friendly. I was out back trimming some shrubs when she walked up to the fence line. "Hi there," she said with a bright smile. "You must be Luke. I'm Vanessa. I just moved into Carl's old place." I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I told her. "Carl was a good guy. You'll like it here." She nodded politely, but I noticed her eyes drifting toward the retaining wall behind me. That wall had a way of doing that to people. She tilted her head slightly. "So, that structure," she said. "Retaining wall," I replied. "Right," she said slowly. "Is that permanent?" I chuckled a little. "Well, unless gravity takes a vacation, yeah." She didn't laugh. Instead, she gave a tight little smile and said, "Interesting." That was the end of the conversation. At the time, I didn't think much about it. But about 3 weeks later, I opened my mailbox and found a certified letter. The return address said Caldwell Design Interiors. Inside was a neatly typed document on expensive-looking paper. It read like something written by someone who had spent a lot of time telling people what their homes should look like. According to the letter, my retaining wall was, and I quote, "visually inconsistent with the aesthetic standards of the community." Apparently, Vanessa had recently installed a new infinity-style pool in her backyard, a project that, judging by the contractor trucks I'd seen, probably cost more than my entire landscaping business. And from her pool deck, she could see the top portion of my wall. She described it in the letter as an eyesore. Her solution was simple. I had 30 days to remove the structure and replace it with ornamental stone that met HOA design guidelines. If I failed to comply, the association would begin issuing daily fines of $200 until the issue was resolved. I read the letter twice. Then I leaned back in my chair and laughed. Not because it was funny exactly, but because sometimes when something is that ridiculous, laughter is the only reasonable response. Still, I figured there had to be some misunderstanding. So that evening I walked down the slope and knocked on Vanessa's door. She answered wearing yoga clothes and holding a glass of sparkling water, the sunset reflecting off the perfectly smooth surface of her new pool behind her. "Yes," she said. I held up the letter. "Hey Vanessa, I just got this in the mail. Thought maybe we should talk about it." Her expression didn't change. "Oh good," she said calmly. "I was hoping you'd come by." And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of a fight. Vanessa stepped aside and motioned for me to come out to the back patio. Now I'll admit, the pool was impressive. A long, narrow infinity edge that looked like it just poured straight into the trees below. The tile was this deep, dark blue, the kind you see in fancy resorts, and the water reflected the sky like a mirror. And right at the far end, if you looked up the slope, you could see the top edge of my railroad tie wall. About 2 feet of it. Vanessa noticed me looking. "You see what I mean?" she said, sipping her drink. I shrugged. "I see a wall that's been holding that hillside in place for 20 years. She gave a soft little laugh like I'd just missed the point entirely. "No, Luke, what I see is something that looks like it belongs behind a tractor barn, not in a residential neighborhood." I leaned on the railing and looked down at the slope. From where we stood, the drop was obvious. The soil between our yards was steep and soft, the kind of ground that gets heavy when it rains. "You ever lived on a hillside before?" I asked. "A few properties, yes. I mean one like this," I said, pointing toward the slope. "Clay soil, winter rain, downhill houses." She waved her hand dismissively. "I'm sure it served its purpose at some point, but that doesn't change the fact that it's visually offensive. The HOA guidelines are very clear about maintaining property value." Now that part made me smile, because property value was exactly why the wall existed. I said, "You realize that wall is the reason your backyard is flat right now?" She raised an eyebrow. "I doubt that. It's holding back about 180 yards of soil." Another little laugh. "Luke, I design high-end homes for a living. I think I understand landscaping." And there it was. That tone. The one that says conversation over. She walked over to the pool's edge and gestured toward the horizon. "I invested a lot into creating this view," she said. "And right now it ends with a pile of railroad ties." I let the silence sit there a moment. "You're asking me to remove the structure that's holding up your backyard?" "No," she said smoothly. "I'm asking you to replace it with something attractive. Stone walls cost money. That's the cost of maintaining standards. And if I don't," she turned toward me and gave a professional smile, "then the association will proceed with fines. $200 a day. Every day? Until the wall was gone." I nodded slowly. "All right," I said. "I'll look into it." She smiled like she'd just solved the problem. "Wonderful. I'm glad we understand each other." I walked back up the hill that evening thinking about something my old boss used to say when we were building retaining systems. He'd say, "Luke, dirt doesn't care about opinions. Dirt only listens to gravity." The next morning, I went digging through my garage filing cabinets. One thing about working construction most of your life, you keep paperwork. Sure enough, buried in an old binder was the original property survey from when we bought the house in 2002. I spread it across the workbench and traced the lot lines with my finger. The retaining wall sat entirely on my side. Not an inch crossed into anyone else's property. Next, I found the building permit from the county. Stamped. Approved. Signed off by a structural engineer. So technically speaking, the wall was legal, permitted, and fully on my land. But I already knew something Vanessa probably didn't. HOA disputes don't always follow logic. They follow paperwork. So I decided to get more. I called a soil engineer I'd worked with before, a guy named David Morales who specialized in slope stability. He came out a few days later with a clipboard, a transit level, and that look engineers get when they see a problem forming in slow motion. We walked the property together. He measured the grade, poked around in the soil, and spent a good 20 minutes examining the retaining wall itself. Finally, he stood up, brushed dirt off his hands, and looked down the hill toward Vanessa's yard. "Who built this?" he asked. I did. He nodded once. "Good work." That felt nice to hear. Then he said something that mattered more. "You ever remove it?" "Nope." "Good," he said again. "Because if this wall disappears, that slope fails." "How fast?" He tilted his head toward the sky. When the rain shows up. In Oregon, rain always shows up. I hired him to write a formal report. Cost me $3,200. A week later, I had a professional engineering document that basically said, in very polite technical language, if the retaining wall is removed, slope failure is highly likely, resulting in soil movement toward the downhill properties. In plain English, the hill would slide. I copied the report, attached the survey, the permit paperwork, and wrote Vanessa a short letter. I kept the tone respectful, explained the engineering assessment, pointed out that the structure was on my land and legally permitted. Then I added one simple sentence. If the wall is removed, the hillside may collapse onto the lower properties. I mailed the packet certified. Figured that would be the end of it. 2 weeks passed. Then another letter showed up. This one came from a law office in Portland. The message was short and very lawyerish. Your retaining wall remains non-compliant with HOA aesthetic standards. The association requests its removal within 30 days. At the bottom, there was a line that stuck with me. Property ownership does not exempt residents from community design rules. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I called my attorney. His name's Greg Foster. Good guy, dry sense of humor, the kind of lawyer who looks like he'd rather be fishing. I dropped the paperwork on his desk. He read through everything slowly, occasionally making little noises like, huh, and, well, that's interesting. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. So, he said, they want the wall gone. Apparently. You warned them? Sent the engineer report. He nodded again. Then he smiled. Not a big smile. The kind of smile that usually means something mischievous is forming. Luke, he said, give them exactly what they want. I blinked. You serious? Oh, absolutely. But the hill is not your legal responsibility if they demanded removal after being warned. He tapped the engineer report, especially with documentation like this. I felt a slow grin creeping onto my face. So what do I do? Simple, Greg said. Get their request in writing. Technically, we already had it from their lawyer. But Greg wanted something clearer, something undeniable. So I sent one final message to the HOA board asking them to confirm that the retaining wall should be removed to meet aesthetic guidelines. 3 days later, the email arrived. Approved by the board president, Vanessa Caldwell. The message said, the retaining wall should be removed or replaced to comply with HOA standards. I printed it out, put it in a folder with the engineer report. Then I rented an excavator. September 15th was a warm Saturday morning. Clear sky, dry ground. Perfect day for demolition. When the rental company dropped off the machine in my driveway, a few neighbors wandered over to watch. Carl's old friend Marty from 2 houses down leaned on the fence and asked, "What's going on, Luke?" "HOA improvement project," I said. He chuckled. Never heard those words end well. By mid-morning, I climbed into the excavator cab and fired it up. The engine growled to life, and I started pulling out the railroad ties. Each one came loose with a heavy crack of soil breaking apart behind it. 20 years of packed earth slowly relaxing as the structure disappeared piece by piece. About an hour into the work, I noticed someone standing down by the pool. Vanessa. She had a glass of wine in one hand and sunglasses on, watching like someone observing a renovation show. When I lifted one of the big timbers out and tossed it onto the pile, she raised her glass toward me, like we were celebrating. So I waved back. 6 hours later, the wall was gone. The hillside sat there exposed, a steep face of damp clay and loose dirt where the structure used to be. I shut down the excavator and stood there for a moment looking at it. The slope looked quiet, but I knew what it was. A loaded spring. And Oregon's rainy season was only a week away. After the last railroad tie came out of the ground, I shut off the excavator and just sat there in the cab for a minute, listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. The hillside looked calm, almost innocent. But when you've worked with soil long enough, you know calm doesn't mean stable. It just means the clock has started. A couple of the neighbors wandered over that afternoon while I was stacking the old timbers in a pile. Marty leaned against the fence again, scratching his beard while he looked at the exposed slope. "You sure about this, Luke?" he asked. I shrugged. Not my call. He looked down the hill toward Vanessa's place. She wanted it gone that bad? Yep. He shook his head slowly. Well, I guess we'll see what happens when winter shows up. In Oregon, winter doesn't exactly knock on the door politely. It just arrives. About a week later, the weather forecast started talking about the first real storm system of the season. Nothing unusual for us, just a big Pacific front rolling in with steady rain. But rain on a hillside is like adding oil to a machine that already wants to move. On the evening of September 23rd, the clouds rolled in thick and low. The air smelled like wet leaves and cedar bark, the kind of scent that tells you the dry season is officially over. By midnight, the rain was coming down steady. By morning, it was pouring. I spent most of that day in my garage sharpening mower blades and organizing tools while the storm drummed against the roof. Every once in a while, I'd glance out the back window toward the slope. You could already see the soil getting darker as it soaked up water. The forecast said the storm would last 2 days. 48 hours of rain. About 6 inches total. Not record-breaking, but more than enough. That night, I went to bed around 10, the sound of rain steady against the windows. My wife asked if I thought the hill would hold. I told her the honest answer. I don't know. Because the truth is, slope failures aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they happen slowly. And sometimes they wait until the middle of the night. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong to rain. At first it was faint. A low rumble, deep and heavy, like distant thunder rolling under the ground. Then it got louder. If you've ever stood near a freight train when it passes, you know that vibration you feel in your chest before you even see the train. That's what it sounded like. Except this train was made of mud. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the back window. For a split second, everything looked normal. Then the hillside moved. Not a little shift. The entire face of the slope suddenly sagged and collapsed downward like someone had kicked the legs out from under it. Soil, roots, rocks, a massive brown wave sliding straight toward the houses below. The sound was unbelievable. Trees cracking, mud roaring, wood snapping. Within seconds, the dirt slammed into the back of Vanessa's yard. Her infinity pool disappeared under a surge of thick clay and debris, the water erupting upward like someone had dropped a truck into it. The pool fence folded like aluminum foil and vanished under the slide. Lights flickered in the houses downhill as the mud spread outward. It was over in maybe 15 seconds. Just long enough to leave a scar across the entire slope. I stood there staring through the rain, heart pounding, watching muddy water spill over the edge of her pool deck. Behind me, my wife said quietly, "Was that the hill?" "Yeah," I said. "That was the hill." Within minutes, lights started coming on in the neighborhood. Doors opening, people shouting over the rain. I grabbed a jacket and walked down the slope with a flashlight. The damage was impressive. Vanessa's pool was half full of mud. The deep blue tile completely buried under 4 feet of brown sludge. The infinity edge that used to spill water over the horizon now looked like a chocolate milkshake. Her pool equipment shed had taken a direct hit from the slide. Electrical boxes sparked quietly in the rain. 2 houses farther down the slope had it worse. The mud had pushed against their back foundations, forcing water through basement windows and cracking sections of concrete. People were standing in their yards in pajamas and raincoats, staring at the mess like survivors after a shipwreck. Vanessa came running out onto her patio. When she saw the pool, she froze. For a moment, she just stood there, rain soaking her hair and clothes, staring at what used to be the centerpiece of her backyard. Then she spotted me, and the screaming started. "You did this." Her voice cut through the rain like a siren. She stormed up the muddy slope toward me, slipping twice before she reached the fence line. "You destroyed my property." I didn't raise my voice. "Vanessa," I said calmly, "you asked for the wall to be removed." Her face went red. "That wall caused this." "No," I said. "Gravity did." She pointed at the hillside. "You knew this would happen. I warned you it might." I pulled my phone out and opened the photos I'd taken of the engineering report. "You remember this document?" She slapped the phone away from her face. "This isn't over," she snapped. "No," I agreed quietly. "It probably isn't." The next few days were chaos. Insurance adjusters showed up. Contractors started inspecting foundations. Mud removal trucks rolled in. By the time everything was tallied, 4 families had filed claims totaling around $140,000 in damages. Vanessa's pool alone was estimated at close to $90,000 to repair. She called me 3 times during that week. The first call was pure rage. The second was threats about lawsuits. The third was quieter, more controlled. That's usually when people realize the paperwork matters. Because my attorney had already sent a letter. In that letter, Greg laid everything out very clearly. The retaining wall had been structurally sound. Its removal had been requested by the HOA president despite a written engineering warning about potential slope failure. And now, the hillside had done exactly what the engineer predicted. But the letter didn't stop there. Greg added one more paragraph. Since the wall had originally been installed to protect the downhill properties, I was willing to rebuild it. However, the cost of reconstruction would be $12,800, plus a 10-year maintenance agreement for annual inspection and drainage service, $850 per year, paid by the HOA. There was also a clause Greg insisted on including. If the maintenance payment was more than 30 days late, I reserved the right to remove the retaining wall again. 3 weeks later, Vanessa resigned as HOA president. The new board approved the contract without much debate. By November, my crew and I rebuilt the wall exactly where it had been. Same design, same ugly railroad ties, solid as ever. These days, the hillside sits quiet again. Every October, the HOA sends me a check for the maintenance agreement. And yes, Vanessa still lives in that house. Sometimes I see her out by the pool, which they eventually repaired. She doesn't wave anymore. But every time that check arrives in the mail, I can't help smiling a little. Because that wall she hated so much is now the thing protecting her backyard. All right, I'm curious now. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that pushed things way too far? Or a neighbor who thought they could control property that wasn't theirs? Drop your story in the comments. And tell me honestly, if you were in my position, would you have done the same thing?